And welcome to episode 6 of The Rent Roll, your podcast on all things rental housing. And I'm a little biased, but I think this episode is going to be fun, at least for me. I get to talk to the former CEO of Fannie Mae, also former CEO of Berkadia, and a founding partner at BlackRock. And he's doing some exciting stuff today as well. We're going to talk to him a little about the housing crisis and the solutions for it. That's going to be Hugh Frater, so stay tuned for that. It's going to be a great conversation. Before that, though, I want to thank our sponsor, Madeira Residential, at madeiraresidential.com. Please check them out. And let's dive into some data before we get into our interview. So, as always, we start off with data and ground our discussion in data. And this chart is an update on something I've shared previously, and I've posted this last week on social media and making the point that I think this is arguably one of the most important charts to be watching right now in the direction of rental housing market. It's the headline here is multifamily completions outpacing starts at a record pace in 2024. This is now updated with September data. So 9 months into the year, this is looking at starts minus completions. Okay. And what it's showing you is that we've completed about 194,000 more units than we started so far in 2024. That is the largest gap in recorded history going back to 1968. This data is from the census. Now, we saw in the mid 70s something a little similar to this, but it wasn't quite this deep. And so we're even deeper. And what that means is that we're seeing a lot of supply now, and inevitably points to much less supply by late 25 and certainly by 2026. Bear in mind, it takes 12 to 24 months to complete a multifamily project, more like 18 to 24 plus typically. So right now we're seeing downward pressure on rent growth because of supply. That's really the main driver right now. But if that goes away, you can very easily see upward pressure returning in the near future. Now, what's the relationship between supply, vacancy, and rents? There's a good new research paper that just came out from the National Multifamily Housing Council. So definitely check this out if you have not seen it. And what it shows here is, let me read from it. The article starts off by saying, how much vacancy do operators tolerate, and how much has this changed over time? Some have alleged that rising rents in recent years are a result of rental housing providers purposely withholding units from rental market and accepting a higher share of vacant units. However, the data tell a much different story overall. And this chart illustrates how much markets with higher apartments vacancy rates in Q2 24, they also tend to record lower and often negative rent growth. And this can be attributed to the short-term surge in new supply. Multifamily completions rose 22.1% in 23 and to 438,000 units, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, the highest since 1987. All right, so it's simply showing that areas with higher vacancy rates see lower rent growth, or in some cases, negative rent movement. No surprise there. So it's a very clean relationship. I always love these boogeyman theories and conspiracy theories. Everybody's trying to find something other than the obvious and the obvious facts to be able to explain what's going on with the data. And but really, there's no conspiracy theory. There's no boogeyman. It's just all about supply and demand. And when there's more demand than supply, vacancies shrink and rents go up. When there's more supply than demand, vacancies rise and rent growth goes down. And so we see that playing out. So good paper from NMHC if you've not seen it already. All right, time for some trivia. Rental housing trivia. And today's question also is about vacancy. The question is, when did rental vacancy peak in the U.S. According to the U.S. Census? And so the census has been tracking housing vacancy for nearly 70 years, dating back to 1956. So when was the peak? Was it A, 1961? Was it B, 1988? C, 2009? Or D, 2024? All right, so take a guess at that, and we're going to answer that question later on in the program. But first, in the news, this is when we dive into headlines that impact the rental housing market and renters and dissect these a little bit. The first headline comes from Bloomberg, Why America's Housing Shortage is So Hard to Fix. And it's a conversation with Zonda's Ali Wolf. And she says the federal efforts to make homes more affordable won't work without more local changes. And so this is a really great Q&A. If you did not see it, I highly recommend it. I want to read some of the Q&A, just a snippet of it really quickly, because I think it does. Allie, as always, does a great job kind of putting into reality some of the narrative around, or putting some facts around the misleading narrative sometimes here. And so the question was, what do you make of Vice President Harris's promise to build 3 million new homes to the market? Allie said her plan to add an additional 3 million units beyond what builders were already planning to build, meaning 3 million additional units. And she says, the first thing I would say is it's well intended. It's a nice idea. But for builders, if they could build more homes, generally they would do it. Now, I want to stop there for a second. This is such a great point. What a lot of people outside the industry don't understand is that builders, whether it's rental homes or for sale homes, they get paid to build. They want to build. If they have capital or can make a deal work to build it, they're going to build it. That's their job. That's what they want to do. It's what they love to do. It's what they get paid to do. They want to build homes. But it doesn't always pencil out. All right. So let's continue on what Allie said. So she said, we know that there are many limitations to be able to reach that goal. Harris is looking at, okay, maybe we can remove some regulation. We hear the same thing from Donald Trump. Maybe we can open up some federal land. But if you think about housing and how actual new communities are built, they're built on a local level. It's going to be based on what the local cities deem to be appropriate, what the zoning levels are, and what the local land use regulation is. And you will see neighbors support new development. And will you see the neighbors support new development? So there can be this push to lower some of the regulatory barriers, but ultimately it does become a local story. Great point. I love that housing is a big discussion right now at the national level, and we're talking about that with Hugh a little bit later in today's conversation. But it's important to remember that at the end of the day, these are very local issues, and the federal government can only do so much. All right, next headline comes from Politico. Headline, 2 presidential candidates agree on something, the source of the housing crisis. The battle over investment underscores a broader political dynamic at play, with both parties casting around for solutions to the high cost of housing. All right, so I've been talking about this one for a while, and I was happy to see Politico pick up on this. Now, one little tweak to the headline I'd make, because it's not both presidential candidates. To be fair, it's the Democratic presidential candidate, Vice President Harris, and then Senator Vance on the GOP ticket side. He's really the one talking about this more than former President Trump. But let me read a little bit from the story from you. To you. It says, Vice President Harris and Senator Vance agree on at least one thing. Large corporate investors are fueling the nation's housing affordability crisis and should be discouraged from snapping at homes. It's a rare instance of bipartisan consensus, but economists and housing analysts say they're both wrong. All right, stop there for a second. Well, obviously, that's true. Housing analysts and economists all agree this is not the source. It's a popular thing to blame. It's another boogeyman theory that we hear about a lot. But we see kind of selectively chosen data points to make this point. But when you really dive into the full facts and figures, it just doesn't add up. This is not the issue. And so let's dive into the story here. And there's a great quote from the always great Jenny Schuetz. And she says, for some segments of both the left and the right politically, big faceless corporations buying up homes and driving people out of homeownership is a very nice scapegoat, which doesn't actually get to the actual problem. Nobody wants to run for office saying the reason young people can't buy their first home is because old people are staying in them too long or paying all cash. That would be politically suicidal. Great quote. I may have to borrow that one in the future. So I've talked about this one at length, but at the end of the day, we just need to build more. Next headline comes from TREP. And so this is more of an industry news update. CMBS delinquency rate jumps in September, driven by retail sector. Now, I highlighted multifamily here. I just want to pull this out for you. I've seen some dire headlines from certain sources about multifamily delinquency. CMBS is only a small tranche for multifamily since we have the presence of the GSEs, or about half the debt market for multifamily. So it's only about 3% or so of the U.S. multifamily debt that CMBS plays. But it's also one of the more noisy sectors that we hear a lot about in headlines. And the data here shows from TREP, multifamily delinquency rate increased 3 basis points to 3.33%. So you can see that's lower than these other sectors other than industrial. And so very little movement. And also, again, for what it's worth, higher risk segment of the market, but again, smaller segment for multifamily. I posted this on social media, and Lonnie Henry from the always great Lonnie Henry from TREP chimed in too. He said, when you add the multifamily agency and CRE CLO loans to the sample, it's not just CMBS loans. The overall delinquency rate nationally is less than 1%, proving your point. Even the short-term CLOs for multifamily are less than 7% delinquent nationally. So good reminder that while the stress is very real, it's not nearly at the scale that some would have us believe. Now let's dig into our next segment. Good question. All right, today's question, I've actually compiled several here. I've been asked about Raleigh, Durham area, the Triangle in North Carolina quite a bit lately. What's going on in Raleigh? Raleigh's rents are down 5% of late year over year. That's actually more than Charlotte down to the south of Raleigh, which is down about 3%. And some folks would have thought the opposite here. And so what's really happening? Well, number one, we have an unusual scenario where there's actually more supply in Raleigh right now than in Charlotte. Raleigh supply is growing about 7.8% versus Charlotte 7%. Now, those are both a lot, right? But at the same time, while Raleigh's seeing a little more supply, Charlotte's continuing to see better demand. And while, again, we're kind of splitting hairs here because that's a similar story in both markets, and I love both of these places long term. I think one thing to consider is that Raleigh gives you those nice anchors of, the eds and meds story, state government, all of those very attractive drivers, as well as an emerging tech sector. But its real quality is the stability of state government and the major universities and healthcare companies or healthcare institutions in those markets. Those also aren't just high growth, fast growth sectors of the economy. And so you do see some of that, of course, in the Triangle, but you don't tend to see those big demand drivers to really push up demand to meet this level of supply. Whereas Charlotte, the job market there is a little more diversified, and you tend to see, I think, a little more upside, even if you don't have the same protection on the downside to the same degree. So again, splitting hairs a little bit, but I think that's why Raleigh has underperformed Charlotte in this cycle. And we may continue to see that here for a little bit. All right, one of my favorite segments, the complaints department. This is when I get to dive into some of the complaints or negative comments I get on social media. I never get to read all of them or get to all of them, but I do want to address some when they get to a point that really addresses a common misconception about the rental housing market. Here's a good one. We're talking about the impact of supply, and someone made this comment. No, research shows rent across cities goes down when you build lower priced housing everywhere. But if you look granularly at the most highly desirable areas within said city, those rents go up due to new stock being more expensive, which raises all rents or prices around it. All right, so this in context, this is kind of a cynical exchange with another commenter in one of the posts I put together. And it reflects a common misunderstanding. And I believe this person writing this probably believes what they're actually saying, but it's a common misconception. It's just not true. So when you think about the impact of new supply, a lot of people get tripped up over this by a very simple mistake. And that mistake is what gets built today, whether for sale or for rent, it does tend to be more expensive because that's what it costs to build. I mean, we've covered this in previous episodes. The cost of construction will dictate the price of the rent of that. And those construction cost drivers are quite high. And so what you build on the rental side tends to be Class A. Now, the impact of that, does it really drive up rents around it? Well, there's been ample research, we've covered this in previous episodes, that show no. In fact, what happens is a filtering effect where these new properties are pulling renters out of older properties, which then puts downward pressure on rents of the properties around it. But sometimes people get confused because they're looking at the data the wrong way. What they're looking at is the average rent for that neighborhood or the median rent, and they see that it goes up. And that's true, but only because the addition of that new supply at the higher price point. And so you really have to look at this at a same store change basis, not just the median or average. For example, if you added a new property that was significantly more expensive, but nobody else changed their rents at all, in that scenario, your average or your median went up for that neighborhood. But that's misleading because the average renter in that neighborhood did not see any change at all. And so in the same way, you have to really look at, okay, beyond the impact of that one new property or any of those new properties, like what happened to the remainder of the population? And in those cases, what the research shows us is, yes, there's either downward pressure on rent growth, meaning that the rents go less than they otherwise would, or rents fall altogether. So either way, new supply, and again, don't take my word for it, there's plenty of academic research around this topic, is always a win for affordability. Now let's return to rental housing trivia. Today's question is, when did rental housing vacancy peak in the U.S.? And so think about your answer. Was it 1961, 1988, 2009, 2024? The answer is 2009. We peaked at 11.1%. Again, the census has been tracking vacancy since 1956, and we peaked at 11.1% during the Great Financial Crisis in 2009. Then by the end of 2010, we were back to single digits, and vacancy has kept dropping from there. Bottom in the recent era at 5.6% in 2002, which not coincidentally is the same time when peak rent inflation hit. And today it's a full percentage points higher at 6.6%. It's been kind of stabilizing in that range according to the census. Now, of course, this data is combining single-family rentals and multifamily together, and apartments, especially in higher supplied markets, we'd see higher vacancy than this. But still, probably not what we saw in 2009 in most of these markets. Also, kind of interesting factoid here, the 2000s decade was the only decade in history that we've seen vacancy get to double digits. It also happened in 2004, 2005, and in the 2008 to first half of 2010 timeframe. Long-term average is about 7.3%, by the way, meaning that we're still below that, even with all of these new apartments getting built. And with that, we're going to transition to the interview. And I'll be welcoming in my friend Hugh Frater, again, the former CEO of Berkadia, of Fannie Mae, and also a founding partner and managing director of BlackRock. All right, now we jump into the interview segment of today's podcast, and I am super excited to welcoming in Hugh Frater from Connecticut, and he's a legend in the industry, working with going back to BlackRock, Berkadia, the GSEs, and now you are have another adventure going with Vessel Technologies. I want to get into that a little bit later, but first and foremost, thank you for being here today.
Well, thanks for having me, Jay. And you're one of the people that's actually a font of wisdom and truth in this industry. There's a lot that aren't, without naming names, of course. But I've really followed your work and admired it.
Oh, well, thank you. Very kind to say that. It means a lot coming from you. So, you've been in this industry a while, and so you've seen housing has taken on an increased spotlight, even on the national campaign trail. It's pretty amazing to see. And as well as DC and all the way to individual cities across the country. And I think there's some good and bad that comes with that, but certainly it's a good thing that we're focused on it. So again, you spent much of your career in housing. So I'm curious just to ask you, how has the policy spotlight on housing changed, especially in rental housing?
Well, I think this presidential election cycle is the first in a long while where housing's been front of mind for candidates. The reasons, in my mind at least, are pretty plain. Home prices and rents have risen faster than wages for a while. At the same time, costs of ownership, like the rate on your mortgage, maintenance and capex, insurance, have all risen dramatically. So for a growing number of people, housing feels like it's a bit out of reach. Obviously, that ebbs and flows. Rates have come down a little bit recently, so people feel a little bit better about it. But for many people in certain economic groups, housing burdens are the highest they've ever been. And logically, since renters are voters too, this leads to the policy emphasis, and as you point out, it's a good thing. For much of our history, the emphasis in housing policy was on single-family ownership. Yeah, and it's been specifically subsidized for over 100 years. First via the mortgage interest deduction, which started at the same time as the federal tax code, and then as a response to the Great Depression, the emergence of FHA, the emergence of Fannie initially of the two GSEs, then eventually the 30-year mortgage, which was an ingenious invention to make housing more affordable for people, but probably at the same time also made it more expensive. Today, I think around 97 or 98% of all residential mortgages are purchased by entities that are directly or indirectly subsidized by the federal government. That would be Ginnie, Fannie, Freddie. I'd also include in that the commercial banks. I would deeply offend many of them, I'm sure, to be called federally subsidized, but that's the way I think about them. But no matter how you look at it, the residential housing sector is heavily subsidized.
Yeah.
And this is all of that's almost all that subsidies on the demand side. And this, in fact, may have made matters worse for those that are trying to attain home ownership. So, in my view, the emphasis on rental housing is really appropriate. We should not be trying to provide subsidies to people who don't need them, and let's figure out how to reduce the overall cost of shelter relative to wages. And the area in which I think we can most likely have an effect is rental housing. The government's footprint in rental housing is large via HUD and the GSEs, but it's not nearly as large as it is in single family. On the one hand, that makes it harder to have an influence, but on the other hand, it also means there's room to do more and there's room for improvement.
Absolutely. And I love particularly very aligned with you on, we want to get subsidy and aid to those who really need it and be much more efficient with that. So and kind of related to it, let me ask you this. I mean, how much do you think of, these issues you're talking about today, how much they could be traced back to policymakers in prior decades, many of them no longer in office, whether it's zoning or supply chain regulation or underfunding affordable housing, et cetera? Like how much of it just goes back to decisions of the past?
Yeah, I think that, there's no single thing that's responsible, but if you were going to pick on a few things, you'd have to turn on the Wayback Machine and go to the early part of the 20th century, which made it harder to build housing and especially multifamily housing with the emergence of zoning regulations. I think in 1916 there were 8 cities that had zoning regulations, and 20 years later there was 1,200 cities that had zoning regulations. I think in the mid 1920s, in the early, I think in 1917, it was the Supreme Court ruled that you could not discriminate. You could not base zoning regulations on race. But then it affirmed in 1926 that you could base zoning regulations on use. So in other words, single family, you could distinguish between single family and zoning and multifamily and zoning. And today, I think 75% of the land in the private land in the country is that's zoned residential is zoned single family residential. So that is clearly one of the factors that has made it difficult to build housing and multifamily housing. In particular, 99% of the time, if you are in a lot that's zoned single-family residential and you want to build something, you submit your plans, and as long as you're not violating code, they get approved. 99% of the time, if you want to build a multifamily building, you submit those plans and you have to have a public hearing. I wonder why that is. But I think it's a fascinating. There is a zoning revolution going on right now, which is a good thing. But if we go back to the root causes. You roll the tape forward a bit. Something very significant happened in the 80s, in the 70s, and in the 80s. In the 70s, the federal government got out of the business of building new housing. That was 1974 or 5. That's when the Section 8 voucher program was started as kind of an offset to added a demand side subsidy. But then in the 80s, you had some really interesting things happened. The savings and loan crisis, which was caused by the disintermediation of the savings industry. Remember, rates rose rapidly during the Volcker era, and the rates that S&Ls could charge on deposits were capped, and so things really turned upside down for the savings and loans. And the significance of that is that the savings and loans were among the biggest providers of land loans to home builders. And what ended up happening, notwithstanding the efforts of the regulators to increase the ability of the savings and loans to take risks to grow their way out of the problem, there was a huge savings and loan crisis in 1986, 87, 88, yep. Which led to the Southwest Plan and the RTC and all of that. But it planted the seeds of something that really limited the ability of small home builders to, and most of the home builders back then were small, limited their ability to gain access to capital. And that just perpetuated over time. The S&Ls got out of the land banking business almost completely. So did the banks. And so the ability of home builders small entrepreneurial home builders to access capital to build homes was severely limited. In 2008, there's a great chart that Doug Duncan, Fannie's retiring chief economist, produced. Yeah. a key relationship was severed. So if you look back over time at home prices and then lagged it by about 6 to 9 months and looked at single family starts, those relationships were in lockstep until 2008. Starting in 2008, the relationship severed completely. Home prices were going up and down. As they went back up, permits didn't move.
Right.
And that's really because, I believe, because the large commercial banks got out of the business almost completely of financing a lot of home builders. And so that undersupply, kind of the seeds were planted in the 80s, and that persisted and was accelerated by the 2008 financial crisis. And at the same time, demography just kept rolling on as it rolls on, and the millennials and other generations were entering the peak years of home ownership and household formation. But we had not been supplying housing.
Yeah.
So I think that's a relationship that hasn't recovered. I don't think there's much we can do to change it, which is why I think the right policy emphasis as we move forward is on the rental side.
Wow, I love the history lesson. I'm a history nerd, and it's so important to think about how yesterday's decisions affect where we are today. And so that leads into the moment, right? So we've seen numerous proposals to address rental housing affordability and accessibility challenges. To me, I hate to be cynical, but a lot of it seems to be like finger pointing and band-aids. And so I want to ask you, just hypothetically, if one of the presidential candidates called you in and said, "Hey, we need to use your experience from Fannie and Berkadia and everywhere else. Help us draft up a proposed policy specifically to address rental housing affordability and supply," what would you pitch?
Well, the first thing I'd say is there's no simple answer, and you know that as well as I do. But I think it's important to understand that. But I would pitch 3 overarching policy principles, 2 policy requirements, and 3 specific tactics with a lot of sub-tactics underneath them. The 3 overriding policy themes: number 1, focus only on the supply side for any new programs. Do not introduce any new demand side programs. 2, reform and improve existing supply side and existing demand side programs. A good example is a lot of the innovation that's taking place now about reimagining Section 8 and how to make sure that 30% of vouchers don't get wasted. That's $15 billion of rental assistance just lying on the cutting room floor for no good reason. And there's a lot of thought going into that. I fear a little bit that on some of the supply side programs like LIHTC, which came out of the 1986 Tax Act, I think those programs could be more efficient. I fear a little bit that there's not the political will to take that on, but I think that it's a topic for another time, perhaps. But I think there is an opportunity to create more housing and preserve more housing by reforming and improving those programs. And then the third policy theme, and this shows my political naivete, politics isn't my lane, is keep it simple. There's a tendency to make it complicated. I don't think it needs to be, and that's not intended to offend all the terrific policy folks out there. But keep it simple. It's just easier to understand and easier to remember.
Those James Carville's thing, right? Keep it simple, stupid, right?
Well, exactly, and that's as true for political campaigns as it is for policy, I think. 2 overriding policy requirements. Number 1, respect the taxpayer as much as possible. Even though we have the world's largest printing press and with the reserve currency, trees do not grow to the sky. At some point, we'll have to pay for all this. Everything these days has a specific pay for and offsets and so on. So I think any new programs we introduce, try and make sure that they can be deficit neutral or as close to it as possible. They're well designed, working with the private sector to make sure there's minimal leakage in terms of low adoption. Don't design things that people won't use, and also, frankly, excess profits. I think that's the private sector needs to earn a fair return, but try to respect the taxpayer. It's their money. And then finally, no undue risk to the taxpayer. We've seen what misguiding housing policies have done in 2007, 2008. We don't want to repeat that. So the taxpayers, in my opinion, should be getting a return on the investments that they make. And then 2, you have to engage both the private sector and the public sector, the sort of traditional housers. That includes the regulators, the agencies, the advocates. But you have to engage the private sector. Nothing will happen unless the private sector is actively engaged. Look at LIHTC as an example. the vast majority of light tech units are produced by for-profit
Yep.
developers. And as I've said to you, and I'd say to anybody else that might be watching, when was the last time you bought a phone from a not-for-profit phone company or a
Yeah.
car from a not-for-profit car company? The answer is never. So there's a reason capitalism works. It just has to be with the right guardrails and the right incentives. And then finally, I'd emphasize three specific policy tactics. Number one, uh, use federal financing to lower the cost of capital for the development of new workforce housing. You've talked about the missing middle. I think there's lots of capital for capital A. It is a big subsidy. It is inefficient, but where a lot of that housing is needed, and I agree with Lori Goodman, any supply is good supply. But let's make sure that if we're providing subsidies, they're targeted to where we want them and need them, and that would be new workforce. This can be done through HUD. It can be done through the GSEs. Really need to engage the private sector to make sure we know what would be effective. But if you think about new development, there's only three inputs: there's labor, materials, and cost of capital. The innovators will do the best they can to lower the labor component, lower the materials component. But where the federal government can help is by lowering the cost of capital and helping ensure that more projects will pencil. And I don't think the idea is to shovel just more money into light tech personally, and that probably is not a popular position, but that's what I think. Number two, provide federal incentives. Think of the YIMBY movements that are taking and legislation that's being drafted, and the movements that are taking hold around the country, providing federal incentives for zoning and permitting reform at the state and local level. You and I both know from the data that you've correctly called out, where we have added supply, rent growth is moderated. It's not super complicated, and I think that the interesting thing about this is I think it is a completely bipartisan issue. States as different as Connecticut and Montana, Florida and California have been forward thinking on zoning reform. Live local in Florida. Hats off to Governor DeSantis. Is very powerful. 8-30G in Connecticut, really powerful. And I think that is a critical part of the equation. And then three, back to the beginning. Really try and spend some time reforming and improving existing programs, because I think you could make them 25% more productive, which would add lots and lots of units, whether that's for preservation, increasing the size of the RAD program, whether that's improving light tech, decreasing the leakage on demand side programs like the voucher programs. I think those three things that I articulated, I think those are well within the capabilities of legislators and regulators. Many of them do not need legislation, as best I can tell. So I think that we can, as long as we keep it simple, as long as we stay focused on the supply side and then reform of existing programs, I think we could get something done.
Yeah, and I think as you pointed out previously too, is that there's not really incentive to bring costs down on the construction side with some of these programs. So that could be a big piece.
Yeah, the problem is the way it's set up now is the more everything costs, the more everybody makes. And I think that's why if you were going to create federal financing incentives, you would focus on new housing that is affordable to workforce users, and on the light tech side, you could even, and again, this wouldn't be popular, you could say we're not going to, our objective should be to maximize the number of units that are produced per dollar of tax credit.
Yeah.
How do we do that?
Yeah.
And that, again, and that might mean in some places like California, unless they change their permitting and zoning requirements, or certainly their permitting requirements and approval requirements, there may not be housing built.
Yeah,
that would be
all the red tape added onto it. Yeah.
That'd be very unpopular. But if you ask any developer, what is their enemy? Time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that is a critical component of this. I've been lambasted by fellow developers about how federal regulation is so messed up, and I feel their pain. And so I think there are positive reforms that can be made. And again, with all the political and policy emphasis on this issue, I'm hopeful that we can get something done, regardless of who's who's sitting in the White House.
Yeah, I agree. And reform is critical. So let me look. Another thing that's happening right now, as you're well aware, is the roles of Fannie and Freddie seem to be changing. And as the former CEO of Fannie, I'm sure you're well aware of this. I mean, historically, as for people watching, you should know Fannie and Freddie have taken a hands-off approach to operations of apartments that started to change with the eviction moratorium during COVID. And now we've seen some new rules around things like notice periods for renewal rent increases, grace periods for rent payments. Honestly, it's nothing crazy. But frankly, I'm just curious to ask you: do you worry about the precedent? Particularly the groups that we now see pushing the White House to install national rent control through the GSEs. So how do you see their role evolving?
Yeah, I do, and I don't worry about it. The GSEs are the largest single providers of capital to the multifamily industry, although they're capped, as you know, at 140 billion a year out of what'll probably be a $400 to $500 billion market in the next 12 months or so. So they're they are influential, but they're not the only game in town. And to the extent they want to uh, make make certain make certain requirements, borrowers are free to go elsewhere. They do have that option, but I don't think, for instance, that I'm aligned with a lot of people that think rent control is a pretty bad idea. The people at Fannie don't think rent control is a great idea. It's politically popular, obviously. But the GSEs do have a critical role to play, especially in times of stress when the CMBS market shuts down and the banks pull back and the insurers pull back, and their countercyclical liquidity role is really important to the health of the industry. And they do provide subsidized, long duration, non-recourse financing, which cannot be found in a lot of other places. So, to the extent that financing is being used, that taxpayer subsidy is being used, I think there's certain things that it's okay for certain things to go with that. You referenced some of the not super egregious, I think just fair tenant protections that were described. Um, I have thought, and I recognize this is a little more complicated, but I've thought if you're using federally subsidized financing, you have to take Section 8 vouchers, even if you're a state that allows you to discriminate on the basis of source of income. But I understand why. I understand why developers are reluctant, because the program is administered by local public housing authorities. You have to keep your unit. Dark for months and months and months, and that's not really fair either. So you need to combine. Both. But I think that the GSEs will largely be driven, in their 16th year of conservatorship or whatever it is. They'll largely be driven by the policy priorities of the administration and the way those are expressed through the FHFA, who's their regulator. Um, I, I personally think it's an argument for getting them out of conservatorship, because they'd be a bit less subject to that. But that's a longer topic.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah. So, one more question for you. You've had a remarkable career in housing and housing finance. You've been an advocate for common sensible solutions around housing affordability. And so, frankly, and this is no exaggeration, you can really choose whatever you want to do at this stage of your career. And you've chosen to be part of a new venture that looks to address affordability in other ways through Vessel technology. So I'd love to learn about Vessel. What drew you to join, first and foremost, and what's your vision for what Vessel can accomplish?
Well, I've long had a passion for housing, and particularly housing finance, and also especially through the lens that I could see things through at Fannie, the challenges that we face from an affordability point of view. And I think I'm the Forrest Gump of financial services. I mean, I've found myself in all sorts of lucky places, and this is just, I guess, another happy example of that. An old friend of mine had designed a really clever system, panelized system for building apartment buildings, 50, 60, 70 unit buildings, really quickly and really inexpensively relative to traditional techniques. And when I zoomed out and looked at some of the problems that you were just referencing, as you pointed out before, the biggest housing shortages and burdens are at the very low and middle income levels. And how do you, without just shoveling more subsidy into the system, how do you meet that need? And it seems like one of the obvious answers, as it is in any other industrial sector, is innovation. But as best I can tell, we're making buildings more or less the same way. There have been some, innovations in supply chain and construction management and things like that, but it seems like we're doing things the same way we did 50 years ago, whereas in every other industrial sector, we do things differently. So the system that we've designed enables us to produce units, really high quality units, probably on average about 150,000 a door. We can do it in 7 to 8 months, plus or minus. If the building inspector gets COVID or something, that could slow things down. But we're building. We have the ability to deliver unsubsidized workforce housing in places where it's needed really quickly. And I think that there should be innovation in this space. There's high profile examples of modular developers who have not met their objectives or exploded in fireballs. There's a lot of reasons for that. We think we found a better way to do things. We're extraordinarily focused on delivery. We're extraordinarily focused on cost, and as our venture partners, we're diligencing our system. They said, "Look, what you're doing is so simple. Why doesn't everybody do it?" To which my answer, at least, was, "Geez, I don't know. I mean, it took a long time to put wheels on suitcases. I don't really know." But we've got a very simple system. It's easy to implement, and we've pre-sold a lot of our pipeline to a workforce owner who we know and respect. And I think we're just scratching the surface. There should be lots of companies like ours at some point. I hope they are. I mean, I certainly our objective is to be a dominant provider of this type of housing. And I think doing it unsubsidized is really really critical. But there will and there should be competition, imitation, whatever it is. And in 1920, I think there were 200 car companies. So it was a good idea. This is a good idea, and we're pretty sure that over time the industry will really embrace it.
Yeah. Well, I certainly hope that they do. Everything helps, and especially, you kind of allude to this. I'm always struck by how construction has not seen near level innovation that we've seen in other industries. So I hope that's very successful.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope everyone's enjoyed this conversation as much as I have, but really grateful for your time.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks for having me on. See you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Hope you enjoyed that conversation with Hugh as much as I did. Hugh, thanks again for joining. That was a lot of fun. Thank you all for the great comments you've been sending about this podcast so far. It's been really encouraging to me. Please keep it coming. If you have feedback that's negative or constructive feedback on how we could do better, let me know as well. Ideas on topics, guests. Want to keep it going. So please keep sending those things along. I always appreciate that feedback, and I learn a lot from all of you. Big thanks again to our sponsor, Madera Residential, and thank you to all of you for spending part of your day with me. Enjoy the rest of your day.